If you listen to Russian President Vladimir Putin and even some U.S. policymakers, it sounds like Russia is marching to an inevitable battlefield victory in Ukraine. But when we take a hard look at the data, a very different picture emerges. A Russian battlefield victory, it turns out, is not inevitable. And in many important ways, the conflict is revealing not Russian strength, but actually weakness. Hi, I'm Seth Jones.
And I'm Riley McCabe. We're here to walk you through the key findings of our latest report, which show how Russia has suffered staggering losses while achieving only modest gains in Ukraine. We have three big conclusions we'll walk you through.
The first is that Russian forces have suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties. That's killed, wounded, and missing, and as many as 325,000 killed since February of 2022. No major power has suffered anywhere near those numbers of casualties or fatalities in any war since World War II.
Second, Russian forces are advancing remarkably slowly on the battlefield, despite being on the offensive in most areas over the last 24 months. And I'll draw our attention to this battlefield map where you can see along the extended eastern front where Russia is attempting to advance. Those forces are moving really slowly at an average rate of between about 15 and 70 meters per day in their most prominent operations. That's slower than almost any major offensive campaign in any war in the last century. And in total, Russian forces have seized less than 1.5% of Ukrainian territory in the last 24 months.
Third, Russia's economy is showing signs of strain because of the war, though it has not entirely buckled. Russian manufacturing is declining, consumer demand is weakening, inflation remains stubbornly high, and the country faces a labor crunch. Economic growth has slowed to 0.6% in 2025, and Russia continues to fall behind in key technologies such as artificial intelligence. In fact, Russia had a grand total of 0 companies in the list of the top 100 technology companies in the world as measured in market capitalization.
We're about to approach year 4 of this conflict, so we wanted to take a close look at Russia's progress so far. To evaluate Russian efforts, we considered Russia's casualties and fatalities, its rate of advance, the amount of territory seized, and the state of its war economy. These factors provide insights into how Russia is performing on the battlefield, whether it's achieving its objectives, and its ability to sustain the conflict over the long run.
Let's start by examining Russian casualties and fatalities. According to our estimates at CSIS, Russian forces suffered nearly 1.2 million battlefield casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, between February 2022 and December of 2025. So Riley, if you could just circle that right part of the screen, you can actually see is the total numbers, the aggregate numbers by 2025, December 2025, getting up to 1.2 million. Of those 1.2 million total casualties, an estimated 275,000 to 325,000 have been killed since the start of the war.
To put those numbers in perspective, Russian fatalities in Ukraine surpass all of those in Soviet and Russian conflicts combined since World War II. And I'll highlight here on our table, Russia's recent losses dwarf what they suffered in Afghanistan right here and in Chechnya. We can compare these losses as well to previous US wars. The United States suffered roughly 54,000 fatalities in Korea, 47,000 fatalities in Vietnam, roughly 2,500 in Afghanistan, and about 4,500 in Iraq.
Of course, Ukraine is also suffering losses as well. We estimate that Ukrainian forces likely have suffered between 500,000 to 600,000 casualties and between about 100,000 and 140,000 fatalities over the course of the war. Combined, this is sticker shock, Russian and Ukrainian casualties could reach 2 million total casualties by the spring of 2026 based on current rates.
So why are Russian casualties and fatalities so high? Well, there are several contributing factors, including Russia's difficulty conducting effective combined arms and joint operations, poorly trained Russian troops, corruption and low morale, and Ukraine's highly effective defense in depth strategy in a war that is strongly favoring the defender.
After the Russian military was unable to quickly defeat Ukraine through a blitzkrieg campaign, started the invasion in 2022, it has resorted now to a strategy of attrition warfare. So what is a war of attrition? A war of attrition is one in which a belligerent, in this case Russia, attempts to wear down its opponent during a series of set-piece battles. Attrition can be distinguished from maneuver warfare, in which an attacker attempts to defeat an enemy by maximizing speed and refraining from those bloody set-piece battles. But on the battlefield, Russian forces rely heavily on dismounted infantry to grind down Ukrainian positions. They're supported by drones, artillery, glide bombs, and other standoff weapons. In addition, Ukraine has also built a defensive front line with trenches, minefields, dragon's teeth, and anti-tank obstacles, and then saturated with the battlefield with drones to shred these Russian assaults. Ultimately, in addition to Ukrainian defensive measures, Russia's strategic, operational, and tactical decisions are translating into enormous Russian losses.
So Russia is suffering an extraordinary human toll. But what is it achieving on the battlefield in exchange for those losses? Well, it's not doing well. In fact, Russia is moving at historically slow rates of advance on the battlefield, and I'll pull up our next chart. What we do on this chart is we can compare the average rates of advance for major offensives in Ukraine since 2022, alongside some historical benchmarks from World War I, World War II, and other wars. At the top, and I'll highlight three here, you can see three recent ongoing Russian campaigns, recent or ongoing. We'll start with the one in the middle here in Pokrovsk. After capturing the city of Avdiivka in Donetsk Oblast in February 2024, Russian forces launched an offensive at Pokrovsk. From late February 2024 through early January 2026, Russian forces advanced only about 50 kilometers. That's an average pace of just about 70 meters per day. For context, that's slower than the Allied forces advanced in the notoriously bloody Battle of the Somme in World War I. Elsewhere, such as around Chasiv Yar and Kupiansk, the other two that I've highlighted here on the chart, Russian forces are moving at mere fractions of the pace of historical campaigns.
That slow pace that Riley outlined is translating into only marginal territorial gains. Since the full-scale invasion began in 2022, Russian forces have seized roughly 75,000 square kilometers, or about 12% of Ukraine. Riley, if you can show them that area of Ukraine. Incidentally, that the other 8% in areas of the Donbass and Crimea, the Russians had taken before the full-scale invasion began. So overall, Russia currently controls 120,000 square kilometers, or about 20% of the country, an area that is roughly the size of the state of Pennsylvania in the U.S. These gains fall decisively short of the Kremlin's goal to militarily conquer Ukraine, and have come, as we've already shown, at an extraordinary human cost.
Let's turn now to look at the state of Russia's war economy, which can tell us a bit more about Russia's ability to sustain the fight in Ukraine and its long-term competitiveness as a global power. Despite Western sanctions, the Russian economy has proven more resilient than some anticipated. Russia's trade balance remains in surplus. The ruble is not far off its pre-war valuation against the dollar, and the country relies heavily on such energy exports like oil.
However, Russia's economy is showing signs of strain now, and long-term productivity looks bleak, including a decline in its manufacturing and input buying, as well as a labor shortage. So Riley, if you could circle 2025, Russia's GDP growth in 2025 was at a lowly 0.6%. The International Monetary Fund estimates that growth in 2026 will now be 0.8%, which is not much better. Russia is also running short on capital. With little foreign investment and no international borrowing, the war is funded by domestic debt and higher taxes. Roughly half the budget goes to the broader military-industrial complex, domestic security and debt service. And overall, Russia's nominal GDP is closer to Canada or Italy, not great powers like the United States or China, or even Germany or Japan. In fact, Russia has a GDP 5.5 times smaller than the US and 4 times smaller than China, making it really a second, maybe even a third-rate economic power.
Russia is also struggling on technology and long-term productivity. Russia is a bottom-tier artificial intelligence power, ranking 28th out of 36 countries in AI development, according to Stanford University. And as you can see from this graphic, and I'll highlight here at the bottom, Russia has 0 companies in the global top 100 tech companies as measured by market capitalization. That's in stark contrast to the countries here at the top, where you'll see, for example, the United States, which has 60, China has 13, and other countries in Europe and elsewhere. The United States is led by companies like NVIDIA, Apple, Alphabet, that's Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. Even Russia's once leading space industry has struggled, underscoring a bleak technological future for the country.
So while Russia still possesses nuclear weapons, and it possesses a large military, it does not measure up as a great power in virtually any category of military, economic, or science and technology indicators. Russia has suffered the highest casualty rate of any major power in any war since World War II, and its military has performed poorly, as we've shown, with historically slow rates of advance and little new territory to show for its efforts, particularly over the last 2 years. Still, it's worth noting that President Putin remains undeterred by the high casualty and fatality rates. President Putin may be willing to accept those rates because most of these soldiers that are dying or are wounded are from such regions as the Far East and the North Caucasus. Those aren't politically vital areas for him, certainly like Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yet, as our analysis highlights, Russia has several vulnerabilities that the United States and Europe can exploit. One vulnerability is Russia's economy. Increased sanctions against Russia's energy sector, including sanctions against countries that buy Russian oil, would likely cause major pain. Russia's shadow fleet of illicit ships that move oil under the flags of other countries to evade Russian sanctions is also vulnerable to action by the United States and European countries. Another Russian vulnerability is the human cost of the protracted war. If Moscow continues to drag its feet on peace talks, the United States and Europe should recommit to multi-year assistance packages that raise the costs of Russian offensives.
Despite Russian challenges, the great irony of all of this is that the US and Europe have failed to fully wield the economic or military cudgels. Without greater pain, Putin will drag the talks out and keep fighting, even if it means a total of 2 million casualties by the spring of 2026.